Okay, ladies, welcome back to Women's Halacha Level 1. It's class number 2. B'ezrat Hashem, we started last week to speak about the intro to Halacha. We're speaking about a little bit of a background of the history. Where did Halacha come from? When did it actually start? We spoke about was Avram a Jew? Was Sarai Imenu a Jew? What happened at Mount Sinai? God coming down. So B'ezrat Hashem, I want to continue today with the rest of the history, maybe even start the first of the halachot. But if we could take just 10 seconds, everybody put their name in the chat right now for attendance. Okay. Be'ezrat Hashem. Okay, let's start. Okay, so we spoke last week that when does halacha officially start? When does it become binding for the Jewish people? So that takes place at Mount Sinai. God comes down and reveals himself to the Jewish people. We spoke last time, two different opinions. Did God only give the first 2 commandments? Did he give all 10 commandments? But God speaks to us. Moshe Rabbeinu then goes up. He learns the rest of the Torah, comes down with the 10 commandments, but also comes down with the beginning of the oral Torah. And then the beginning of the written Torah, either Moshe Rabbeinu writes step by step as it happens inside the desert, or he waits till the end of his life, writes down the whole written Torah, but we have the oral Torah explaining the rules, explaining the details of the halachot in detail, and that's how it kind of goes throughout the initial part of the Torah, through the 5 books of Moses. Then we get to the beginning of the Navi. Yoshua enters the land. We conquer the land of Israel, and then we're going to have a bunch of books of prophets. We're going to have prophets and we're going to have writings, Nevi'im and Ketuvim. Does anybody know the difference between Nevi'im and Ketuvim? Nevi'im versus Ketuvim, prophets versus writings. Yeah, Rafaela.
Like Naveem is like this like stories about like the people who are able to like kind of I guess speak with Hashem. But I don't know much about Ketuvim. I only really learned.
Okay, good. So the Nevi'im is the prophets. That's God speaking to them, giving them messages. The early prophets talk about the actual stories in Israel. The later prophets are more about warnings about don't mess up too big, because if so, you can get to exile. And they ultimately were exiled. Anybody know what the Ketuvim, what are the writings book all about? What are the Ketuvim? What's an example of Ketuvim? Anybody know example of books that fit into Ketuvim?
Wait, what is Ketuvim?
Ketuvim are the writings. We have ourselves in the written Torah. We have the Tanakh, the Torah, the Navi, and the Ketuvim, which is the writing, which is the Torah, the 5 books of Moses that we read in Shul on Shabbats. We have the prophets, and then we have the writings. What books are the writings? We have some very famous books. Sydney.
I'm kind of guessing, is one of them Esther or like
One of them is Esther. We read it on Purim. The book of Esther is one of the scrolls, one of the writings. The book of Ruth that many have the custom to read on Shavuot. Yeah, Rafaela.
Is the Gemara part of Ketuvim or no?
No, Gemara is oral Torah. We're going to get
Okay.
the Gemara in a second. We're getting there in a second.
Okay.
What else?
Don't you read the Ketubah on your wedding day or something?
No, Ketubah is something else. Ketubah is the wedding document. Now we're talking about Ketuvim. Ketubah means to write. Lichtov means to write in Hebrew. Ketubah, it's actually a funny name, but the Ketubah is the written document for a wedding. Very good. Ketuvim are the writings, which is certain books of the written Torah. Book of Esther is one of them. Book of Ruth is another one. We also have Tehillim, Psalms. Those of you who like to pray, say some Psalms. That's also the books of the writings. So it's quite a books of writings. What are those books? So the prophets was God speaking to the Jewish people in the beginning of our time in Israel. The writings were written at the exact same time, or along many of the similar generations, but it was more the perspective of man as he relates to God. If you read the Psalms, read the Tehillim, it's David HaMelech talking to Hashem, praying to him in all different types of situations that he had in his life. We have Shira Shirim, we have the Song of Songs, we have Kohelet, a book about reality, what life is all about. It's more man's perspective, divinely inspired. That's the written Torah. The oral Torah stayed oral. We spoke last week. We gave a couple of reasons last week. Why do we want the oral Torah to stay oral? It's better for teaching that way. You have a teacher-student relationship. It makes the halacha a little bit more gray, so it can change with the times. That was the oral Torah. But we're going to fast forward now to around the year 200. Now, around the year 200, life got really bad for the Jews because we already had one exile, and then we already had a second temple being destroyed and a second exile happening. Life is tough. Okay, so I'm going to share my notes with you. Okay. So we've been speaking. We're like up to this area over here. We'll get to the year about 200. Persecutions are really bad. Comes along the big rabbi of the generation. His name was Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, also known as Rebbe. You heard the name Rebbe? Rabbi. He was known as Rebbe. He was the main rabbi, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. He looks around. Life is difficult. There are laws that you're not allowed to learn Torah. You know, we know the famous story of the Maccabees. They're hiding out in the caves, and today we play with the dreidels because they used to play games to try to hide the fact that they're learning Torah. Similar in the Soviet Union, not too long ago, Jews are hiding in classrooms and in different areas to try to learn a little bit of Torah. In this generation, the year 200, it's against the law to keep Shabbat. It's against the law to do a Brit Milah, to do a circumcision. It's against the law to learn Torah. People are forgetting things. Life is hard. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi comes up. He says, you know what? We're forgetting the oral Torah. We're just not capable. We're not sitting in the yeshivas anymore. We're not capable. What do we have to do? We have to start to write it down. And he begins to write down the laws, one law after the other. And he separates it into very organized books. One book is like agricultural law, because most of them are farmers. We have a book of holidays. We have a book of marriage laws, a book of tort laws, of criminal laws. Different books are set up, 6 main sections, and it's called the Mishnah. And the Mishnah is studied until today. Little kids, my son is 9 years old. For the last 2 years, he's been learning what's called Mishnayot, which is the base of the oral law. Basic laws, straight up. Little kids are taught it today here in Israel nonstop. In America, not as much, because in America, the language barrier, so they teach more ideas in America than actual rules. But here in Israel, the kids have the Hebrew language already from a young age. They're studying Mishnayot, they're trying to memorize it, and they're getting little candies if they can learn it well. Okay, that's what's happening in the year 200. Then life keeps getting difficult. And the laws that were written in very quick shorthand. So we have all these rules in all the main sections of Torah, but questions start happening. They start having debates amongst the different rabbis. Now, at this point, the Jewish people are split already in exile. So we have part of the Jewish people are in the land of Israel, but that's the weaker part of the Jewish people. Then we have the other part of the Jewish people. They're now in Bavel. They're now in Iraq, and they're setting up yeshivas in Iraq as well. And in both of these areas, they're debating the laws, and they're actually sending the information back and forth between each other, and they're debating, how does the halacha work? How do we keep Shabbat properly? What is the law when somebody steals in this case and in that case? And they're debating it back and forth. And again, it's getting difficult. So they said, okay, it's time to write it down again. And at this point, they write down what's known as the Gemara. The Gemara is the section of the oral Torah that explains the Mishnah, but it goes back and forth and gives the different arguments. And it's much more thorough. And it goes from all different angles, and it explains in detail what everything is all about. That's called the Gemara. In around the year 400, they wrote the first version of it in Israel. It's actually called, they put it together with the Gemara and the Mishnah together. They called it the Talmud. Or they called this version, the one written in Israel, the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud. Today, ArtScroll made an English translation, and I think it's a French translation also. You could read it. It's actually not studied so much because there's a later Talmud, which we study today in the different yeshivas and in some seminaries. We even have a class by us in Talmud. That's the Bavli Talmud. What was the Yerushalmi Talmud? It's the oral Torah written in Israel, but actually not in Jerusalem, because Jerusalem was already destroyed. So even though we call it the Jerusalem Talmud, it was really written more in the Galil area, because that's where Jews were living, because everybody had fled because Jerusalem was destroyed. Fast forward 100 more years, the majority of Jews are actually living in exile, but in Bavel, in Babylonia, that's the main yeshiva there as well. They also write a Talmud. They also write their version of the Gemara that explains the Mishnah. They call it the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, and that's the main Talmud, the main Gemara. If you hear anybody's learning Talmud, anybody's learning Gemara, if you learned it in the past, if you have friends that are learning it, this is what was written around the year 500 in Babylonia, studied till today, some of the deepest stuff. If anybody, those that are getting to Israel, when you in 2 weeks, Mr. Hashem, we'll see you here. Those that are coming, those that want to have Chavrutot, they want to learn it more in detail, we could definitely set that up. But it's the basis of our knowledge, our understanding, but it's complicated. It's straight logic, it's hard level logic, it's philosophy, it's legal law, it's agricultural law, it's mathematics, it's all in the Gemara. That takes place, that's the oral Torah until the age of like 500 CE. Questions on the Gemara, anybody? Any questions on the Gemara? Questions? Unmute if anybody has any questions up until now. Okay, fine. So let's keep going. Okay, so doing history now of oral law, where did it go to? So we had the Gemara, that was the base. But the truth is the Gemara was a little bit difficult because the topics are, it's kind of like, to compare it a little bit to like constitutional law in America, where it could be talking about a specific rule of law, and they'll relate it to any other law that seems so distant practically, but if in legal theory it's similar, so we'll learn a law about marriage from a law about Shabbat, even though the different rules completely, but the legal theory behind it, when to be strict, when to be lenient, and whatever's going on in that case, could be brought in. So it's very good for legal thinking, but a little bit complicated to actually know what to do. So only the really learned people knew the Gemara. The rest of the people would ask the rabbis questions. Okay. So now let's fast forward. For the next, let's say around 500-600 years, what happened to Halacha? What happened to Jewish law? So people would go to rabbis, they would ask questions, and the rabbis would collect those questions, and sometimes they'd publish books, and they would call those books responsa. Responsa is a fancy English word. In Hebrew, it's much simpler. In Hebrew, responsa is she'elot utshuvot, which means questions and answers, and they would answer questions and answers and publish it in a book, so people would know what to do. And that's kind of the way Halacha worked for about 600 years. The big rabbis were sitting in Iraq and Bavel and Babylonia. People would send them questions and they would answer and they would write books on it. Okay, great. Now, at the same time in Jewish history, Jews are starting to spread all over the world. Israel has already fallen. While there's always going to be Jews living in Israel, there was always a continuous presence of Jews in Israel until today. If anybody ever says today, you can hear in the news today, these Jews are European colonialists that have no connection at all. They're not the indigenous people. They're kicking out the indigenous. They're occupying the indigenous people. That's just incorrect historically. Jews have always lived in Israel. There are people here that have never left. You have these 10th generation Jerusalemites that you can meet here in Israel. These people have never, there's always been a small presence. It's been small because we've been exiled, we've been killed, we've been banned from Jerusalem for certain years, for certain decades in our history. But in Israel itself, there's always been Jews. And if anybody says that all of Israel's European colonialists, well, you know what? We have more than half of this country is Sephardic. They're coming from Middle Eastern countries, from all over the area. So this whole concept that we weren't from this region is actually not true. And we even predate most of, Arabs, for the most part, the idea Arab comes from Saudi Arabia. That's a much later phenomenon of them coming into the area of Israel. So we've always had a presence here, but it was weak. And there were very few. And Torah-wise, it also got pretty weak. There were always some rabbis here in Israel that were great. And people always wanted to make aliyah, and the very the very spiritual people at the end of their lives would try to make it here, but it was poor and difficult. So there weren't that many. Iraq for a while was the strongest Torah. They had made yeshivot there, but finances, money, business was starting to be all out the rest of the world. And because of the way the empires worked back then, you can travel to whatever conquered that area. So Jews start to spread out. Jews start to go west. They're going over from Iraq. They're spreading out. They're going over to Iran. They're going to Yemen becomes an area, and then they're going east. Then they start spreading west, and they're going to go through Africa. Egypt had a very large population. Even in the times of the Talmud, there were many Jews in Alexandria. So Jews are living in Egypt, but then they're spreading. They're going to Tunisia. They're going to Morocco, and they're making it up to Spain. And in Spain, they're going to begin to create a community. Then slowly, Jews are going to make it up to the Ashkenaz. They're going to make it to Germany. They're going to be in France. They're going to make it to England. Then you have to fast forward a bunch more years. They're going to start to move east again towards Eastern Europe, to Ukraine, to Poland, to Hungary, to Russia. They can get to other areas as well. Okay, but let's say we're in the year 800. Yeah, Noah.
Sorry, wait, I didn't get why they were moving, like why they were traveling.
Money,
Oh,
money,
okay.
business. Israel is difficult. It's hard to live there as a Jew. So you look for opportunities. It's one of the reasons why not all the Jews live in Israel today. You know, where are you going to find good business? Where is it? We're going to have better opportunities for my family. Okay, so they moved around, and now it's the year 800. Okay, so now let's imagine this. It's the year 800, and you're one of the new communities in Spain. You moved to Castile, you moved to Toledo, you're sitting somewhere in Spain, and you're opening up your first community. Now, when a Jewish community starts, if anybody here is from a small Jewish community, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. If you're from the New York or something like that, it's hard to understand this. But you have a small new community that's opening up. In the very beginning, you're probably not going to have any rabbis because nobody can afford just yet. You haven't made it business-wise yet to build up. Your first steps are going to be to build a shul, to build a mikvah. And then eventually you're going to say, okay, maybe now we could bring in a rabbi. Maybe now we could bring in books. Back then, books were very expensive. There wasn't a printing press yet. Everything was being written by hand. So just to have a set of the Talmud, that already cost a lot of money. There probably was only one, either at the rich guy's house or in the shul. And if you're a brand new community, you don't have it yet. Okay, but let's say the community is the year 800. You have a couple hundred Jews now living there. No big rabbis yet. You have a big question. How do you get the question answered? Julia, are you with me? You're in Spain. There's about 100 Jews there. You have a question in Halacha. You want to know, how do I light my Shabbat candles? Do I make the bracha before I light the candles or after I light the candles? How do you get your question answered? Huh?
Ask your rabbi.
There is no rabbi. How would you do today? Today, you would get on your WhatsApp, text your rabbi, pick up the phone, make a phone call, Google search the answer, maybe if you want to be a little bit more independent. But you have who to ask today. Back then, how do you get your question answered?
You can ask another Jew.
You can ask who?
Another Jew.
Ask another Jew. But you're living in a country where people aren't that learned just yet. And you went to the most learned rabbi, or the most person that you call the rabbi.
You ask your mom.
Ask your mom. I hear that.
You ask your mom because it's based on minhag, right?
No, so there actually is. It's really actually true. There are a lot of customs that developed in the areas. Some of them that are correct, and some of them are incorrect, just because people do whatever they ask their parents, and people weren't as learned. And things did develop that way. And you would ask your parents, but I'm talking about different. Your parents have questions. You're a parent now, and you have a question. So what do? So in the year 800, you would send a letter to the rabbis that know. Where do the rabbis know? We said they're living in Bavel, in Babylonia, in Iraq. So you're going to have to send a letter from Spain to Iraq. Now, that's going to take a long time. There's no email, there's no WhatsApp. You got to get this letter to travel from Spain down through North Africa, we'll go through Morocco, go through Egypt, and then pick a way to get to Iraq and keep crossing over. But back then, you wouldn't travel by yourself. That was way too dangerous.
Don't they like set up a new center for Judaism in like the West?
They're going to, but that takes time. It's going to take them another 200 years to begin. And in 300 years, their center is going to be so good that they're going to actually they're going to pay to bring in, they're going to get so rich as a community. They're going to pay to bring in some really good rabbis, to bring in some really good books. In that generation, it's called the Golden Age of Spain. It was actually a golden age for Jews and Muslims. They lived together in peace for the most part. And not in all cases, but in most part they did. And everybody was into knowledge and being intellectual and smart and to know languages and to know your religion. And they brought it in. So by the year 1100, Spain is going to be the powerhouse and Iraq is going to fall and not be that powerhouse anymore. You know, similar to if we go back 100 years ago, if you were in Poland, if you were in Lithuania, that's where the biggest rabbis and the biggest Torah was. Today, there's barely any Torah in Poland. There are some rabbis, some shuls, some this, but the Torah level over there, nobody's publishing books that there's no halacha books coming out of Poland today. Halacha books today are coming out of Israel, a little bit in America, maybe a little bit in Canada, a little bit in France. You'll have single people in England and in South, but it's really very, very, very few coming out of these areas. The real halacha books are coming out primarily from Israel, and in the last 20 years, a little bit from America and Canada. Yeah, Rafaela.
Okay, wait. So if they're sending their letters all the way to like Babylonia, what are they gonna do in the meantime? Because they're probably not gonna
Excellent,
get back
good,
forever.
excellent question. So first off, how long would it take to get a response?
Really long time.
A response could take 6 months to a year to get back. So now I gave a question like lighting Shabbat candles. The truth of the matter is, they'll write that question down, but they're not going to be so worried about that question. That's not the most pressing question they're going to have. And they'll just pick away. And sometimes they'll write a question like, we had this question in our community. We didn't know what to do. So we did XYZ. Rabbi, was that the right thing to do? Or was that the wrong thing to do? Can you explain to us for the future? Sometimes the questions were big questions, burial questions. Those are big deal questions. What do you do with life and death questions? And those could be big things. Sometimes they were more mundane. They probably asked as many questions as they could think of because it was expensive. You have to send it with the messengers that are going. When you have yourself those caravans that are moving, so there was some post office system that was going with them. You have to pay taxes because every step along the way, you have yourself guards that are going with these different caravans. And they would travel together. They would stop in a city for a little bit of time, refuel, get some more food, get some more water, continue the journey, and make steps along the way until eventually got to Iraq. Also, a lot of times, if you are the new business people in Spain, you want to show that you're making money. And you want to thank the rabbi for taking the time to answer your question. So what are you going to do? You'll probably send a donation. Till today, you find this. You're going to send a donation to the rabbi. Thank you so much for answering my question. We want to support you. That's why we went out here anyways in the first place. We're not living in Iraq or in Israel or wherever it's going to be at the time. The rabbi answers the question, thanks him. A lot of times the rabbi wrote a book. So today, from a history perspective, we could actually learn what's happening, what happened back then, based on what the rabbi who's answering Babylonia, he took all those questions and said, this guy from Castile asked me question XYZ, and I answered like this. And that's what we studied today to know what actually happened. Yeah, Jenny.
I was wondering, how do you become a rabbi back then?
So to become a rabbi back then, first thing you have to do is you have to study. You have to have access to books. You have to have the ability to sit and learn. Meaning, you probably have to have a father and a mother who said, I want this kid to be a learner. I want him to actually be somebody. So I'm now going to hire a tutor to start teaching him. And if he really liked it and he was willing to be poor for a while, you sit. It's actually pretty similar today also for people who want to become rabbis. You have to have some kind of money source and you have to have time and effort. And then you have to have a teacher to train you in learning. In those days, if you were living in Iraq, there actually was a yeshiva. And that was a center. So if you really want to learn, that's where you went to learn. I'd say similar today, like let's say in America, for example. So if you want to learn Torah in America today, so there are certain cities that have really big yeshivas. The biggest in America today is Lakewood. There's thousands of people learning Torah. If you want to become a rabbi today, you spend some time there. Yeshiva University, they have a whole section of people learning nonstop in the city in Yeshiva University in Manhattan over there. They're learning Torah in detail. If you Baltimore has a yeshiva system. Miami, where I grew up, there are 2-3 yeshiva systems. It's not as big as New York, New Jersey area. LA has a small group over there. But so there are certain places where they can build you. Some places are known as more elite. Here in Israel and Jerusalem, you have the more elite yeshivas, you have the less elite yeshivas, so there are different levels. Back then, it wasn't as many people, but there were places to go. Eventually,
the original rabbi, who was the first rabbi, and how did he learn those things if he didn't have money to purchase the books and writing?
Oh, so good. So that's the history that we said until now. The first rabbi was Moshe. Moshe we actually call Moshe Rabbeinu. So we back up a couple thousand years to the beginning of Mount Sinai, we spoke about last week. That's Moshe Rabbeinu. He's the first teacher. And then Moshe had students. Joshua was his primary student, but he had 70 other students that were learning there. And generation by generation, people were learning. There was always a value to have learners. Sometimes it was certain tribes, like Levi was known more to teach. Shimon was known to be teachers. So you had certain tribes, Yisachar, you had certain tribes that a little bit more. but any individual could have become a rabbi, could have become a teacher. Women as well. Devorah is known to be one of the big prophetesses. If you actually go back to the old school times, you had a lot of women that were very much involved in this as well in the process. Okay. So every generation there's always was, but there are certain time periods when it was easier and when it was harder. It actually probably was easier when we were in charge. In the times of the prophets, it was much easier to have learners than it was when the exile began for those first 500 years. But eventually they build up. Okay, so the letter from Spain makes it to Iraq. The Halacha questions get there. Rav Hai Gaon, Rav Saadia Gaon, these were the big rabbis. That were their names. They were called the Gaonim. Gaonim means the wise people. The Gaonim, today we call them rabbis. Back then they were called Gaonim. Gaon in modern Hebrew means to be a genius. These were the big rabbis. They would answer the questions, they would send it back. So 6 months go by. You're waiting for the answers to the questions that you sent. So we have like stories that are written down. What happened when they finally got that letter back from the rabbis in Iraq? So it says that in Spain, they had a custom. When the letter came back, they would take a silk pillow and they would take, now the letters back then were written by hand. There wasn't printing presses just yet. They wrote the letter down. They would bring it into the Beit Knesset and everybody would party. They would make great desserts. They would dance around, praise the Lord. We got the answers. Thank you, Hashem. They would dance and dance and dance and say, we have new Torah. And then they would read the answer out loud to everybody. And those that were the most learned of the community would read it over and over it. They would pride themselves on having that piece of paper. And that became part of the Torah that they would learn with whatever other books that they had. Okay. Let's fast forward a couple more 100 years. And we get to the year around like 1100. At this point, Iraq is no longer the stronghold. Now, Torah has moved. The community in Spain had become very rich. They had brought in major rabbis. They had taught major rabbis. The education system in Spain was now the best in the world. But at the same time, in France, in Germany, also some very big rabbis are living in France and Germany. And this becomes now the center of Torah in the world. And these rabbis did a lot of writing. We call these rabbis from the 11th century on the Rishonim, the early rabbis. So from the 11th century on, we have the early rabbis. You don't have to know these names. It's just more to get the idea of what's happening in Judaism. Today's the history lesson. Next week, B'ezrat Hashem, we're going to get to actual laws. But Rishonim, they're called the early rabbis. They revolutionized Torah. Because what did they do? They organized things. There were certain rabbis, the most prominent one being the Rambam, Rav Moshe ben Maimon, known as Maimonides. If you heard of the Maimonides hospitals all over the world, why is it called Maimonides Hospital? Because this rabbi was a super rabbi. He was a doctor. He actually, in his generation, the Muslims got a little bit crazy. He had to flee for his life, and he actually moves to Egypt, where he becomes the chief doctor of the Sultan. And he spent most of his day being a doctor. But at the same time, he also wrote book after book after book. He wrote books of philosophy, known as Mor Nevuchim, the Guide to the Perplexed. He wrote a book called the Sefer HaMitzvot, the Book of the Mitzvahs, where he wrote all 613 mitzvot in one book. But then he wrote a book called the Mishnah Torah. The Mishnah Torah was the first book of its kind that went through all of the commandments. It's 14 volumes that went through every halacha, every Jewish law he could think of, but he organized it. It was very, very clear. It was actually so organized, we didn't realize until hundreds of years later, when somebody actually counted every chapter in these 14 volumes, and they got to 1,000 chapters, meaning the book is organized to begin with. But if the greater number becomes 1,000, that means that from the very beginning, he had a plan of where he was going. And that book was known as the Mishnah Torah. If anybody here is a Yemenite, for the Yemenites, this till today is the main book of Jewish law. And he wrote about everything. Fast forward a little bit more, and now we're going to get to, let's see. Also, other rabbis wrote books about halacha. We have a book called the Torah Shulchan Aruch. You don't have to know the name, but there was another book that was written also about law that was more practical law. The Rambam, Maimonides, his book, wrote about everything. But then different rabbis said, you know what? People need an easy-to-read guidebook for practical law that only applies in our generation. But then something crazy happened. Life got really bad for the Jews really quickly. The Muslims in Spain were kicked out. The Christians came in. And we have in 1492, the great expulsion of the Jews. And when this happens, Judaism got such a big hit that it still till today reverberates what took place in 1492. Because at this point, you have all these Jewish refugees. And these refugees start scattering everywhere. Some go north to Europe. Some go south to Africa. Some get to Israel. Some get as far as Syria, because some go up to Greece. And you have these Spanish Jews who ran away. Spain in Hebrew is known as Sfarad, the Sephardic Jewry. And until today, if anybody calls themselves Sephardic today, where does that name come from? It comes from the refugees of Spain. Now, the truth of the matter is, we probably won't get into this, but some people might not even trace their lineage to Spain and still call themselves Sephardic today, because that's how much this identity, the Sephardic Jew who once was at the height of power and unbelievable, and now he's this refugee. And these refugees, a lot of them get to Israel. Now, Ashkenazim, the Germany and France, they themselves now also, life is not always the easiest either. They're also scattering around. They're moving towards Eastern Europe. They're moving towards Poland. Jews were in exile on the run for a very long time. In Israel, you have all these Jews from different places. They counted something, I think, like 15 different synagogues based on which city you came from, because people would band together. Oh, I come from this area. My family comes from that area. And people try to, like, stay together a little bit. There was a rabbi. Now we're going to fast forward like 1500s. This is now like next generation. After the expulsion, this is the kids and grandkids of the refugees. They're sitting there in Israel, and there's this one big rabbi. His name is Rabbi Yosef Karo. And here, if we get back to my notes, let's go down to it. We fast forward to my notes. We get to 1563. There's a rabbi named Rabbi Yosef Karo. Now, Rav Karo is living in Sfat. Sfat, Bezrat Hashem, those that make it to Israel, we're going to get there this year. Sfat is a special city because there's refugees from everywhere. There's Jews from everywhere. Jerusalem is destroyed. There are some Jews there in Jerusalem, but the main center of Torah in Israel is now in Sfat. But Sfat is interesting because there's all types of rabbis there. There are rabbis who like the Parsha, who give good speeches, very charismatic speakers. We have rabbis who are into Kabbalah, mystical ideas. The Arizal, which is known as one of the Rabbi Luria, one of the greatest Kabbalists ever. He's living there as well. And then there's a rabbi named Rav Yosef Karo. Rav Yosef Karo, he is into Jewish law. He is into Halacha. What does Rav Yosef Karo say? He says, people are getting confused. There are all these different customs happening at the exact same time. And it's complicated. People don't know what to do. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to write a simple book that tells the laws, law after law after law. Very simple. So that everybody could understand it. Everybody could be clear. And now, the year 1500, it's a really big year because we're post-printing press already. And Rav Yosef Karo knows marketing, and he starts to understand, okay, how do I organize a book with clear chapter numbers, with clear things that's going to be printed? Because now my book could make it to a lot of places. So he looks around, he sees different customs. He says, okay, how am I going to decide what's the law? Because now, with all the years of the exile, we have different rabbis writing different books over the last couple hundred years, and people are arguing with each other. So how do we decide what the law is? So he said to himself, there were like three main rabbis that everybody agreed to in Israel. Two of them were Sephardic, one was Ashkenazi. He said, you know what I'm going to do? Majority rule. If 2 out of 3 of those rabbis said A, the law will be A. We'll go with majority rule. And he wrote a book called the Shulchan Aruch, which means the set table. Shulchan means table, Aruch means set table. He writes this book of simple laws, simple practical laws. That's the book of Halacha that anybody wants to be studied to be a rabbi today. This is the base book you have to begin with. We'll go back to the Gemara too. We'll go back to all the earlier books. But the Shulchan Aruch, that's the base for modern day Halacha. Okay. At the same time, there was an Ashkenazi rabbi, Rav Moshe Isserlis, living in Krakow in Poland. And his shul is there until today. Those who have been on Poland trips, March of the Livings, you go to his shul, you can pray in his shul today. We did a Poland trip in Bar Ilan last year. I was with the trip 2 years ago. We prayed in that shul. I was chazan in that shul. So Rav Moshe Isserlis was the big rabbi in Krakow. And the book of the Shulchan Aruch from Israel, from Tzfat, gets into his hands. Anybody can tell me, how does a book from Israel, how does this halacha book from Israel make it to Krakow? Any ideas? Who brings it there? Any ideas?
Can you repeat the question?
How does this book, okay, so this rabbi in Tzfat writes a book of law, and it gets in the hands of a rabbi in Krakow. How does a book get there? Why does a book get there? So it's important to realize that back then, people traveled. People traveled, some people traveled even just to explore. There were explorers too, people traveled around, and Jewish books traveled as well. Books got from Israel to Europe, to Spain, to Morocco, to Yemen, to Russia. Books are getting around. How did the books get around? How did Torah books get around? So there were two primary ways that I was reading about how these halacha books made it places. One way is now that the printing press was invented, people had to print their books. But in Europe, there was the Christian, the Christian church, the Vatican, Roman Catholicism. They had a major censor on anything that was being printed because they had to make sure that nobody wrote anything anti the church. So they even had ex-Jews, Jews who had converted to Christianity. They would read through every single book that was out there to make sure that there wasn't anything anti-Jesus. Also Muslims, they were reading their books to make sure there's nothing anti. So what did they say? We have a couple of cities in Italy. We have 2 cities in Italy that have printing presses. If you want to publish a book, you got to come here and publish your book, and it has to go through censorship. And this is now going to be, it's going to take time. It's going to be something like a 6-month process itself just to publish the book. So first off, you have to travel there with your book, with your money to publish it. It has to go pay the bribe to people along the way to read your book, to get it published. At the same time, there's other rabbis there that are trying to publish the book at the same time. So what do? If you are the scholars of the world meeting at the same time in the same place, you're going to share your books. So that's one way that the books got there. Another way is through fundraising. Israel, throughout Jewish history, has been, since the first exile, has been a pretty poor country to live in. Truthfully, it began to change in the year 2000. Here in the year 2000, we became the startup nation. And for the first time, we thought in 2023 that Israel had reached the stage where our economy is strong. We have good business, we have good high tech over here. And we thought for the first time that we might not have to rely so much on like the big uncle in America. In the 1960s and 70s and 80s in America, in the 40s, 50s, in the founding of the state of Israel, Israel needed a lot of financial support from Jews in the diaspora. We're going to see if after this war in Israel, if we're going to need more help. Even today, American Jewry, Canadian Jewry, British Jewry, French Jewry, diaspora Jewry helps us out a lot. And we want to thank everybody all over the world who supports us, who donates, and especially now during our war in Israel. It's a really big deal that everyone's helping us out, helping our causes out. And I hope that after this war ends, we'll be able to bounce back up, be that startup nation, and be able to survive on our own. Hopefully. We'll see how bad it gets, but financially. But for the first time, really in the year 2000, Israel became for the first time not this poor country. For most of history, Israel was the poor country. So what would they do? They used to send people to raise money for the poor people in Israel. They would raise money for the yeshivas. They would raise money for food kitchens. And till today, yeshivas send out emissaries all over the world to raise money. So what would they do? They would travel around the world. One of these guys makes it to Krakow. Now what happens? How do you raise money? How do you raise money for rabbis in Israel, for yeshivas in Israel, for kol? How do you raise money? So you get to a new city and you go up, you find the Jewish community. You go to the community center. You go to the synagogue. You walk up to the rabbi. You're like, hi, rabbi. My rabbi from Israel sent me to raise money for the poor people in Israel. Do you know anybody who wants to help? So the rabbi of the synagogue will say, yeah, first off, I have a discretionary fund from a rabbi. Take a little bit of money from me. And then he says, go to those 2 people there. They're the rich people here, and they love to support Israel. And if somebody gives a donation, what would you do? If you give a donation, the person who came from Israel will give you a present. He says, thank you so much for supporting us. Here is a book from my rabbi in Israel. And the Shulchan Aruch, this book of Jewish law, gets into the hands of the Ramah, the main rabbi in Krakow. And he starts reading this book. And he's like, oh my God, this is an unbelievable book. This is like a book of halacha. And he says, I was doing the exact same thing. I was writing a simple halacha book for 1563 that everybody can understand. But you know what? And in a move that was so humble, he says, instead of me writing my own book, let me put my book on the side. I'm not going to write that book. Instead, I noticed there's some places where here in Poland, we do things differently. Ashkenazi law seems to be different in a couple of areas. Let me just write my notes on the Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch means set table, literally. He writes notes that he calls the mapa, the tablecloth. Let me write a tablecloth. Let me write some notes on these laws to make it that Ashkenazi halacha will be here as well. And then in one book, We're going to have everybody. It's going to be a standard, a code of law for everybody. And it's true, because until today, everybody has you studies. Everybody has this one book. A couple of Yemenites still do the Rambam, but the majority of halacha is based off of this book. Now, interesting, it was unbelievable, because now you have one book that unifies everybody. On the other hand, for the first time, we have clearly Sephardic versus Ashkenazi law. Meaning, until this point, it wasn't laid out as clear as this. The people spoke about Sephardic law and Ashkenazi law, but it wasn't like, there could have been Sephardic law that disagreed with the Shulchan Aruch, and there could be Ashkenazi law that disagreed with what Moshe Isser was. But at this point, once you have a book that's being printed, that everybody's buying, and it says, this is Sephardic law, this is Ashkenazi halacha, so now for the first time, over the next couple hundred years, it's really going to create the first level of differences in halacha, and what we have today of these differences between different groups of how we do things. Okay. Let's just fast forward. We're almost done. Let's fast forward, get to today's time. For the last 500 years, people have been doing more responsa, more questions and answers, answering when people ask rabbis questions. They answer, they write them in books, they modernize it. People have been writing notes, footnotes, commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch. The most famous, the Ashkenazi one, is the Mishnah Berurah, written a little bit over 100 years ago, where he explains and modernizes it up to 100 years ago. And the big halacha today is guidebooks. Today, people write rules about everything. How to make challah. They'll have a 500-page book of how to make challah. They're gonna write books and guidebooks in English and Hebrew and French and Spanish and Russian, every language possible. They're gonna write very detailed guidebooks that today halacha is very accessible. And also, the newest version of how we have halacha today is online. People are gonna write questions on online forums, on social media. There can be WhatsApp groups that are going to answer questions. And these WhatsApp questions are now going to be brought into books that we're reading as well, because they're some of the most modern questions, and also questions that in the past nobody would ever answer, and nobody would ever ask, because they would be embarrassed to ask. Today, because everybody has access to rabbis online, and you can do it anonymously, questions are being asked about everything known to man. So today, halacha is more alive than it's ever been in the past because of these online Q&As. Questions on any? I just went through about, let's see, today we covered about 3,000 years of halakhic history. Next week, Bezrat Hashem, we're going to start with the first halakha of waking up in the morning, and we're going to get a lot more legal. So for those that like history, I hope you enjoyed. Next week, we're done with history. We're getting into Jewish laws. But any questions on anything? If you didn't put
Do
your
you
name
have
in the chat,
attendance?
yeah, if you didn't put your name in the chat yet, write your name in the chat right now. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you. Shalom.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Yom Tov.